Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder, Chapter 5, Part 2, The Story of Grandpa's Sled and the Pig. When your grandpa was a boy, Laura, Sunday did not begin on Sunday morning as it does now. It began at sundown on Saturday night. Then everybody stopped every kind of work or play. Supper was solemn. After supper, Grandpa's father read aloud a chapter of the Bible, while everyone sat straight and still in his chair. Then they all knelt down, and their father said a long prayer. When he said Amen, they got up from their knees and each took a candle and went to bed. Then they must go straight to bed, with no playing, laughing, or even talking. Sunday morning they ate a cold breakfast, because nothing could be cooked on Sunday. Then they all dressed in their best clothes and walked to church. They walked because hitching up the horses was work, and no work could be done on Sunday. They must walk slowly and solemnly, looking straight ahead. They must not joke or laugh or even smile. Grandpa and his two brothers walked ahead, and their father and mother walked behind them. In church, Grandpa and his brothers must sit perfectly still for 2 long hours and listen to the sermon. They dared not fidget on the hard bench. They dared not swing their feet. They dared not turn their heads to look at the windows or the walls or the ceiling of the church. They must sit perfectly motionless and never for one instant take their eyes from the preacher. When church was over, they walked slowly home. They might talk on the way, but they must not talk loudly, and they must never laugh or smile. At home, they ate a cold dinner which had been cooked the day before. Then all the long afternoon they must sit in a row on a bench and study their catechism, until at last the sun went down and Sunday was over. Now Grandpa's home was about halfway down a side of a steep hill. The road went from the top of the hill to the bottom, right past the front door. And in winter it was the best place for sliding downhill that you can possibly imagine. One week, Grandpa and his two brothers, James and George, were making a new sled. They worked at it every minute of their playtime. It was the best sled they ever made, and it was so long that all 3 of them could sit on it, one behind the other. They planned to finish it in time to slide downhill Saturday afternoon. For every Saturday afternoon, they had 2 or 3 hours of play. But that week their father was cutting down trees in the big woods. He was working hard, and he kept the boys working with him. They did all the morning chores by lantern light and were hard at work in the woods when the sun came up. They worked till dark, and then there were chores to do. And after supper, they had to go to bed so they could get up early in the morning. They had no time to work on the sled until Saturday afternoon. Then they worked at it just as fast as they could, but they didn't get it finished till just as the sun went down Saturday night. After the sun went down, they could not slide downhill, not even once. That would be breaking the Sabbath. So they put the sled in the shed behind the house to wait until Sunday was over. All the 2 long hours in church next day, while they had kept their feet still and their eyes on the preacher, they were thinking about that sled. At home, while they ate dinner, they couldn't think of anything else. But after dinner, their father sat down to read the Bible, and Grandpa, James, and George sat still as mice on their bench with their catechism. But they were thinking about the sled. The sun shone brightly, and the snow was smooth and glittering on the road. They could see it through the window. It was a perfect day for sliding downhill. They looked at their catechism and thought about the new sled, and it seemed that Sunday would never end. After a long time they heard a snore. They looked at their father, and they saw that his head had fallen against the back of his chair, and he was fast asleep. Then James looked at George, and James got up from the bench and tiptoed out of the room through the back door. George looked at Grandpa, and George tiptoed after James, and Grandpa looked fearfully at their father, but on tiptoe he followed George and left their father snoring. They took their new sled and went quietly to the top of the hill. They meant to slide down just once. Then they would put the sled away and slip back to their bench and the catechism before their father woke up. James sat in front on the sled, then George, then Grandpa, because he was the littlest. The sled started at first slowly, then faster and faster. It was running, flying down the long, steep hill, but the boys dared not shout. They must slide silently past the house without waking their father. There was no sound except the little whir of the runners on the snow and the wind rushing past. Then, just as the sled was swooping towards the house, a big black pig stepped out of the woods. He walked into the middle of the road and stood there. The sled was going so fast it couldn't be stopped. There wasn't time to turn it. The sled went right under the hog and picked him up. With a squeal, he sat down on James, and he kept on squealing, long, loud, and shrill. Then they flashed by the house, the pig sitting in front, then James, then George, then Grandpa. And they saw their father standing in the doorway looking at them. They couldn't stop. They couldn't hide. There was no time to say anything. Down the hill they went, the hog sitting on James and squealing all the way. At the bottom of the hill they stopped. The hog jumped off James and ran away into the woods, still squealing. The boys walked slowly and solemnly up the hill. They put the sled away. They sneaked into the house and slipped quietly to their places on the bench. Their father was reading his Bible. He looked up at them without saying a word. Then he went on reading, and they studied their catechism. But when the sun went down and the Sabbath day was over, their father took them out to the woodshed and tanned their jackets. First James, then George, then Grandpa. "So you see, Laura and Mary," Pa said, "you may find it hard to be good, but you should be glad it isn't as hard to be good now as it was when Grandpa was a boy." "Did little girls have to be as good as that?" Laura asked, and Ma said, "It was harder for little girls, because they had to behave like little ladies all the time, not only on Sundays. Little girls could never slide downhill like boys. Little girls had to sit in the house and stitch on samplers." "Now run along and let Ma put you to bed," said Pa, and he took his fiddle out of the box. Laura and Mary lay on their trundle bed and listened to the Sunday hymns, for even the fiddle must not sing the weekday songs on Sundays. "Rock of Ages, cleft for me," Pa sang with the fiddle. Then he sang, "Shall I be carried to the skies on flowery beds of ease, while others fought to win the prize and sailed through bloody seas." Laura began to float away on the music, and then she heard a clattering noise. There was Ma by the stove getting breakfast. It was Monday morning, and Sunday would not come again for a whole week. That morning when Pa came in to breakfast, he caught Laura and said he must give her a spanking. First he explained that today was her birthday, and she would not grow properly next year unless she had a spanking. And then he spanked her so gently and carefully that it did not hurt a bit. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, he counted, and spanked slowly. One spank for each year, and at the last one big spank to grow on. Then Pa gave her a little wooden man he had whittled out of a stick, to be company for Charlotte. Ma gave her 5 little cakes, one for each year that Laura had lived with her Ma and Pa. And Mary gave her a new dress for Charlotte. Mary had made the dress herself, when Laura thought she was sewing on her patchwork quilt. And that night, for her special treat, Pa played Pop Goes the Weasel for her. He sat with Laura and Mary close against his knees while he played. "Now watch," he said. "Watch, and maybe you can see the weasel pop out this time." And then he sang, "A penny for a spool of thread, another for a needle, that's the way the money goes." And Laura and Mary bent close, watching, for they knew now was the time. "Pop," said Pa's finger on the string. "Goes the weasel," sang the fiddle as plain as plain. But Laura and Mary hadn't seen Pa's finger make the string pop. "Oh, please, please do it again," they begged. Pa's blue eyes laughed, and the fiddle went on while he sang. "All around the cobbler's bench the monkey chased the weasel, the preacher kissed the cobbler's wife, pop goes the weasel." And they hadn't seen Pa's finger that time either. He was so quick they could never catch him. So they went laughing to bed and lay listening to Pa and the fiddle singing. There was an old darky, and his name was Uncle Ned, and he died long ago, long ago. There was no wool on top his head, in the place where the wool ought to grow. His fingers were long as the cane in the brake, his eyes they could hardly see, and he had no teeth to eat the hoe cake, so he had to let the hoe cake be. So hang up the shovel and the hoe, lay down the fiddle and bow. There's no more work for Uncle Ned, for he's gone where the good darkies go.